Well, actually, I feel like it's a reunion. I look over to my right and I see Nancy Lee, Carlisle, Judy, Annabelle, Dana, Carolyn, Cushion, and Bill Butler. And you wonder why I mentioned Bill Butler. Bill Butler used to go to my school, Snow Hills High School, where I go to. And his dad was named Sykes Butler. And Sykes Butler was the ag teacher there. Wonderful ag teacher. And we used a term for Mr. Sykes Butler. We used to call him Pa Butler. We loved him that much. It was a term of endearment. Now, don't you believe he didn't teach us the future farmer with a faithful and not a words but a deeds. I mean, we learned that how to cross every T and every dotted right. That was back in the old days. And I feel like I know Bill, and it's certainly nice seeing him. I do have a story that I want to tell you, and it's a story that quite amazing, honestly. My family, the Turnage family in Snow Hill, they try to keep this story secret. And successfully so for over 150 years. Nobody knew anything about it. And that was amazing. Now, to tell you properly, to give you some background of the story, I'll tell you a little something about the community where I grew up. I grew up in what they call the Tyson's Marsh community in Greene County near Snow Hill. Very small community. And my family moved to that community back in the 1700s by way of Pitt County, Chowan County, the Isle of Wight in Virginia, and then we originally came from the county of Essex in England. And so that's our county, that's our folks and how we got there. Now they'll say small. When I say small, I mean minuscule. And I apologize for sitting down. It's simply because I can't stand up. But I was thinking, as I thought about this little community was no more than 3 miles long and maybe 1.5 miles, 2 miles wide. And that was the extent of the community. But in that community, we were self-sufficient and very independent and to a degree isolated. Now, that's been interpreted by some as being backwards. But anyway, that's where we lived and we enjoyed that life. We were self-contained in the sense that we had our own sawmill, of which I can take you right to that spot where it took care of all construction needs. We had our own grist or corn mill called Turnage's Pond. Some of you in the northern end of the county, it used to be a popular place for fishing. But that's where we got our mill. And then the school, we had our own school. My mother and father built their house on the old school site. They're in this little small community now. And then we had our own church, which a lot of you are good Christians, but we're Primitive Baptists. We were Primitive Baptists. And we had our own community cemetery, of which Patricia and I have made plans to be buried there, and of course, hopefully later than sooner. But anyway, that was our community. Now, you can't define us by what we've achieved or what we accomplished as a family, or even what we acquired, but you can define us as our love of Jesus Christ. That's number one. Number two, our love of country, how important our country is. And when I say country, and if you'd have to, and I'll get to that a little later, but I'm not only talking about the United States, and I'm talking about the United States, but I'm also talking for a period of from 1861 to 1865, I'm also talking about the Confederate States. I mean, there are some in our community that still feel like Jefferson Davis is maybe our 16th president. I mean, that was just sort of to help identify the kind of community that we lived in. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the characters that will show up in this story, and it'll mean more to you when I get to them. My great-grandfather was named William Levin Turnage, born in 1796. And he had several children, two of which I'll mention because they're part of the story. One was Joe Turnage, which happened to be my grandfather, and then Sylvester Brown Turnage, which was Joe's older brother. And then in 1836, William Levin died, and his wife, Sonetta Ann Tyson, that came from Pitt County, she married a Huell Hart in 1837. And from that marriage, there were 2 children, C.C. Hart, which actually was one of my great uncles, C.C. Hart, Christopher Columbus Hart, and also Macomb Hart. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about my granddaddy and my grandmama, but particularly my granddaddy, because from my granddaddy I learned the love of family and the love of history. And he knew the history of that marsh when you think it's just 3 miles long and just 2 miles wide. So everything went on in that community, Granddaddy knew. Now, Granddaddy was born in 1867, so he knew it for a long time, and Grandmama 1869. And my mom and Daddy had built a house there on the farm, the same farm which Wallace has come from. But anyway, and I apologize, sometimes my mind comes and goes, but I'll do the best I can with this. But Granddaddy would tell me all these stories, and I just learned everything about the marsh. I mean, I knew the land where it had weak spots, good spots, and I'm not talking about the Turnage land. I'm talking about all the neighbors' land. I mean, that's the way we were. I mean, we knew all the neighbors. We not only knew their neighbors, we knew their mules by name, and we knew the ones that could work and were smart and ones that won't. We knew the hounds. You know, foxhounds, that everybody had foxhounds. That was part of their entertainment back then. And I've heard my granddaddy and others talking about these different hounds and different mouths they had on, which was the lead and all this other kind of stuff. And actually, when they talked about them, they were talking about those animals just like they were people. I mean, it was close knit. Back then, they didn't have the benefit of MSNBC or Fox News. Everything they had to be, again, like the community itself, was self-contained. But that's just sort of the way we live. Now, I'm going to start with the beginning of this story. The beginning of this story actually started in my grandmama and granddaddy's attic. And in that attic was a trunk. Now, I had an Uncle Doc, bachelor farmer. And when he finished farming, you didn't use the word retirement back then. He farmed till he couldn't. He came to live with Grandmama and Granddaddy, and he brought with him this trunk. And in this trunk were all his valuables. Well, he died in 1947, and when Uncle Doc died, they moved the trunk upstairs in the attic. And sometime shortly thereafter, I was 8 or 9 years of age, I was in that attic, and I spied that trunk, and it was unlocked, because all the monetary valuable things had already been removed. But what I found in that trunk was the beginning of this story, and I brought that with me this morning, so I want to share with you. Let me get this box out here. And this would mean nothing. Now, we all have a common bond in that we love history. Of course, if you didn't love history, what I'm about to say is not going to mean anything to you. But that bond is that these are things that are so significant to me and mean so much to me personally as a Turnage growing up in that Tyson's Marsh. But in the trunk was, one thing was this little box here, but in this box, Uncle Doc kept all his, these are property receipts, county receipts. I mean, poll tax, county tax, special tax, school tax. And it started out where he was paying $4.99 a year. That was his tax. Now, you know what inflation will do. Toward the end of that, he's paying over $17 a year. The second thing that I thought was unique and meant a lot to me, this, you can't see it too well, but this is just a little sheet of paper, lined paper. But on that paper is attached little locks of hair. And they used to do that way back then. They had this little locks of hair, and on it my great-granddaddy, Joe Turnage, who fought in the Civil War. His hair's on this little piece of paper. And Nancy, his wife, is there. And Laura. And then I go right on down, my granddaddy John and his brother White, C.C. Hart. And that was significant to me. And to anybody else, that wouldn't mean anything. And on the back side was, that was left in there was some paper Confederate money, and I guess by 1947 they figured it wasn't that useful. But the thing that really is the beginning of the story are these two little old letters here. Now these two letters were written to my Uncle Doc. And both of them were written in March of 1916. The first one, the 2nd of March. But in that letter, he wrote Uncle Doc, and he asked Uncle Doc how he was doing, how the family was doing, what kind of weather they were having, and that kind of thing. And he had two requests of Uncle Doc. The one is that said, Doc, please write me, because I hadn't heard from you, and I hadn't heard about what's going on in the marsh. So write me and let me know. And then he also said, if you will, write C.C. Hart, which C.C. Hart was Uncle Doc's uncle. He said, write him because he has inquired about you and wondering if you were still in the land of the living. You know, just don't know anything about it. Well, then by the end of March, March 26th, he wrote Uncle Doc another letter. In that other letter, he wrote and Uncle Doc and thanking him for writing him and letting him know what was going on. But he also, in the letter toward the end, he asked if Uncle Doc would send him a tom thumb that he made. He said, because up here, they just don't make tom thumbs like they do back home. Now, that doesn't mean a lot to you, but it will in just a minute. And I guess all of you know what tom thumb is. You know, sausage. But anyway, at the end of the letter, he signed his name. And he signed his name Wallace Turnage, 105 Van Horn Street, Jersey City, New Jersey. And having heard all those stories that my granddaddy had told, and had heard all those stories about everybody going off to war, and about, and the marsh was right in the pathway of this line of Union soldiers that would always come from Newbern to Kinston, right on up to Goldsboro. I think the Wilmington Weldon Railroad is what they were after. And the devastation that they caused to our pack houses, our chickens, our hogs, and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, it was one wave right after the other. So we didn't necessarily have a real affinity toward what, we didn't call them Union soldiers, we called them Yankees. That was the term that was used. But when I read that, I said, good grief, that was a Wallace. I never heard of a Wallace Turnage. And secondly, I thought, 105 Van Horn Street, Jersey City? Well, that's Yankee land. And it just blew my mind. So one day, Granddaddy and I were having one of our conversations that he loved to have. And out of the blue, I said, Granddaddy, I said, who's Wallace Turnage? Well, he stopped and he looked at me and he said, what? I said, who's Wallace Turnage? Well, where did you hear that name? I said, I read it in some letters he wrote Uncle Doc. Well, where did you find the letters? I said, well, it was in Uncle Doc's trunk that I found upstairs in the attic. Well, now my Granddaddy John, I'm named after him, Granddaddy John, he admonished me. And what I mean by admonishment, those letters went back in that trunk and they didn't see the light of day until the 1960s. 1960s when I became in possession of them. Well, that would end the story. And this part is going to be almost unbelievable. In 2000, that's 1948 probably when I first was introduced to those letters. In 2010, some over 60 years later, I was in the bookstore over in Greenville, Barnes & Noble, and I pulled this book out. And this book, the only thing I saw in that shelf was up there like that. That's the only thing I saw. But I pulled that book out. And when I pulled it out, I opened up the dust page, and it had the name Wallace Turnage. But I didn't think that much about it until I turned to page 55 of that book, the second chapter. And page 55, I'm telling you, I don't know whether any of you have ever had what you call a serendipitous moment in your life. That was mine. Just by chance, just by luck, when I read those first two sentences, it told me everything I wanted to know. Now, I don't believe, honestly, because I love my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, because I would not be here today if it weren't for the power of prayer of my sister-in-law, Carolyn, and Patricia, and our church, and so many people have been praying for me. And it's just a pleasure to be here, just to be able to see you and look at you and talk to you about this. But I believe that book found me rather than me finding it, honestly, because the first sentence of that on page 55 says, Wallace Turnage was born August the 24th, 1846, in the Tyson's Marsh district of Greene County near Snow Hill. Man, I knew who Wallace was. But what really got me was the next sentence. The next sentence said that Wallace was born from a slave woman named Courtney and a white man named Sylvester Brown Turnage. That was my great uncle. And then I knew why Granddaddy admonished me about those letters. He had a stigma about those letters. And he was, I guess, ashamed that Wallace was not only a slave, not only a first cousin that he was, but he was somebody that evidently they were ashamed. That's why they tried to keep it a secret. But you know what? I've often thought, I don't know a Turnage in my family that's ever come out of Greene County that they ever wrote a book about. I mean, and here, that's just the way it was. But now I want to get into this. Well, actually, got to come back a minute. I often wondered how did that name lift itself from those two letters and found their way into this book to be sold to the public, something that my family tried to keep secret all those years. I always wondered that. So I want to fast forward to 1984. 1984 in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a rest home. And in that rest home was a patient. And the patient's name was Lydia Turnage Connolly, 99 years of age. And on that day, she was being visited by her neighbor and good friend, Gladys Watt. And they were talking. And Lydia said to Gladys, says, I've got something that I want to give to you because it's always been important to me. I've always kept it. But before I give it to you, I got to tell you that I'm not Portuguese. That in this box that I'm giving you is a book that my daddy wrote. And my daddy wrote a book. He was a slave, and he wrote a book about what happened to him during the Civil War. Now, Gladys takes the book, takes the box, carries it home, reads the book. You know what Gladys did with the book and the box? She put it in her closet. That's 1984. Now, it's amazing how all this comes together. Now, from 1984 to 2002, 18 years later, Gladys was watching public television, and a program came on called Unchained Memories. And that Unchained Memories was about slave narratives that was compiled by the WPA back in the 30s. Anyway, she was watching that. She said, that book might be worth something. So the next day she called Deborah Mackey. Deborah Mackey was the librarian there at Greenwich Public Library. And she told her about the book. Deborah came out, looked at the book, and said, man, you really have something here. says, I think you really got something of some significance. So Gladys gave the book to Deborah. Deborah took it to the library. That Deborah was also like Earl Hardy here. Deborah was the president of the Greenwich Historical Society. And she just so happened to have invited this David Blight up from the coast, New Haven, Connecticut, up at Yale University, and asked him to come down to give a lecture to the society, and he did. And she shared that with him. That was in 2002 now when this took place. And David took the book, and it was a book. He calls it a journal, but took the book, and then he had another such narrative, and they were, you know, to get a narrative, a manuscript of what occurred during the Civil War by a slave after the war, that's almost unheard of. It's very, very unusual. But he had these two manuscripts, and he put them together, and in 2007, by Harcourt, Brace and Harcourt, he published that book. And then 3 years later, 2010, I was there, and it just found me. It was just an amazing story to me. But anyway, now I'm going to tell you about what is in the book. Well, I wrote David Blight and got in conversation with him because the two letters did not coincide with the book, with his book. Now, I give David Blight all the credit. He was a researcher, a historian. He also chaired the Lehman Welder Center for Slavery, Abolition, and Emancipation. That was his title. So he looked at that book and that journal from a particular perspective. Like I told somebody earlier, sometimes when you're talking to a researcher and when you're reading a historical piece and it has anything to do with slavery, Civil War, the South, and so forth, you really need to know, you really need to focus on the empirical data, the primary sources, because you can get somebody's perspective out of kilter. Because David, in talking about Wallace's journey, added his own interpretation of that. And he came up with like, for example, how Wallace, he had to slip back into the marsh to get his mama. And I mean, things that just didn't jive. So we had conversations back and forth for a good while. And I told him about the letters and how they wasn't congruent with what he had, and he wanted the letters. And I told him that I'd be glad to send him the letters. But what I wanted was the original manuscript, the actual writing that Wallace wrote. I wanted a copy of that. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, and after about 6 months, and this is one time the South did prevail, I got the manuscript, and when he sent me the manuscript, then I sent him the letters. But this is the manuscript, 120 pages. That's copied, and the story that I'm going to tell deals more with the manuscript, because this is actually what happened. This is unabridged. It's uninterpreted. This is the raw, empirical, primary source data, and that's where you'll get the story. And he starts out his book in the third person, the first sentence, and he said, Wallace Turnage's apology for his book. And then he went on to say that this is a sketch of my life, or adventures and persecutions that I went through from 1860 to 1865. Now, I cannot speak disparagingly of those who sold me, nor of those who bought me. I can say, though I had a hard time, it had a tendency to make me a man. Now, that sort of tells you the kind of guy he was to me. Now, this is a man that we evidently was ashamed of for whatever reason. But the more I read and make connection with Wallace through these writings, the more I am more proud of him. I couldn't be any prouder, because he was my flesh and blood. I mean, he was my granddaddy's first cousin. Well, anyway, this is going to get sort of hairy to you. He went on with his book, and he said when he was 14 years old in the spring of 1860, he was home in the family. Now, one thing about Wallace, in his journal, he never mentioned the word slave. It was always hands or servants. And he never anywhere made any kind of excuse or any kind of rationalization as to the plight that he was in. And I thought that was outstanding. And another thing he did is he loved the Lord Jesus Christ. See, he learned before, at 14 years of age, he could read and write. And at 14 years of age, he loved the Lord. Well, they came to, he said the family, which was my family, came to him and asked him, says, Wallace, we've got you up here, you're 14 years of age now, and we want you to, we just want you to be able to go out on your own. And so we got it worked out where you can be a nurse down in Morehead City. And Wallace, in his book, said, so you know, I considered that and thought about that, and they also told me that any time I wanted to come back home and visit my mama, I could. And he said, you know, I thought that was a good idea, so I considered to go. I consented to go. And I thought that was unusual, you know, being a slave, master, and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, they sent a Reuben Wallace to get him. And Reuben Wallace was from Morehead City. So the next day, they take off on a little wagon. They take off to go what Wallace thought was Morehead City. But Wallace said about midday, he noticed that the sun was always hitting him on his right shoulder. And he knew that Morehead was just east of Snow Hill. So there was something wrong with that picture. And he found out when he got on the corner of 14th and Franklin Street in Richmond, there was the biggest slave trader in the world, or in Richmond at least, right there by the name of Hector Davis. Now another thing, all of this that I'm saying can be authenticated, and it has been authenticated. And how it was uncanny how he knew names and places and dates and distances. He just knew that. I think he was evidently must have been a pretty smart man. But anyway, Reuben sells Wallace for $950. He didn't go through the auction. Now, him being 14, Hector didn't put him in the jail with other slaves. He made him a place there in the office, and he made Wallace his office boy, because it was Wallace's job to go to this jail every day or whenever, get the slaves that were going to be sold, take them to a dressing room, and in the dressing room to prepare them for the auction block. And one of the things, you know, he said they'd take a little bit of lard and rub it in the hands and rub on them, you know, to clean them, make them look good. But it's just unreal. Just so, to me, it's just so interesting. But this went on for about 6 months, and then he said that there was a man, a clever man, came to him by the name of James Chambers. He said, Mr. Chambers said he was clever because he tried to get me to like him, you know, just by what he talked to him about. He says, and you know, I really thought a lot of Mr. Chambers. So one day Mr. Chambers asked him, he said, Wallace, how would you like to come live with me? He said, well, I'd like that. And so this is the second time that Wallace was sold. This James Chambers bought Wallace from Hector Davis for $1,000. Never has Wallace, as of yet, been put on an auction block. So Wallace said the next morning that he, along with a drove of other hands, boarded a train I don't think they had the planes back then. You say when you get old, your mind slips. But anyway, they boarded the train, and 72 hours later, he wound up in Pickensville, Alabama, just a little old town just east of Mississippi. But in Pickensville, it took him 72 hours to get down there. It was a long ways and just a little ways down the road. But Wallace said that Mr. Chambers kept him at his house and fed him and talked to him, and they just had, and that was another thing that Wallace had to say in his book. A lot of people weren't used to Wallace. See, Wallace had never been beaten, and Wallace had never been taught that you don't look directly to somebody. You know, most people were taught, to look down or look off. And in some instances it caused, a good relationship. But in other instances it caused confrontation. Depends on who you're talking to. But anyway, Mr. Chambers, that Monday morning, they sent him out to the plantation. And Wallace called it the big farm. And he went out there, and he said he looked around and looked at everybody and said there were 75 hands out there in that field. And then the record shows through the U.S. Census slave schedule, shows that this James Chambers in Pickens, Alabama, had about 80 slaves. But anyway, they were out there, and said when he got out there, said everybody just came and huddled around him and wanted to get news back in Virginia and everything they could get about it. And he said all of a sudden they stopped, and boy, they went to work like pulling what he's called pulling fodder. Probably a lot of you don't know what that means. But when they used to way back there, they pull the leaves of corn and make fodder. So they're pulling fodder. I mean, they just went to work. Didn't look up or anything. He said, well, he couldn't imagine what was happening. So he looked around, and across the field, according to Wallace, said that was an ordinary, shabbily dressed man come walking across the field. It said when the guy got there, and he learned later that his name was Mr. Horton, he was the overseer. Well, when he got there, he called out two ladies, two women, and he says, I'm going to find out the reason why. I just want to know why y'all hadn't been working like you ought to. So he had one of the ladies to take the other one, lay her down on the ground, pull her dress up over her head, and Mr. Horton began to just frailing her. In the meantime, he looked over at all those 75 slaves and said, what in the world, or hands as he called them, said, he couldn't fathom it. It just overwhelmed him. In the Tyson Marsh community, there were not 45 hands in our whole community, and to see all these slaves, said, but while this man was beating this lady, endlessly, they were working. They never looked up. They never said anything. And then when he finished beating one, then he turned around and beat the other one. They just reversed roles. And Wallace was just astounded. He was shocked. And after that happened, Mr. Horton walked on off, and then they worked and started chatting and so forth. And he looked at him and said, are y'all crazy? Said, did you see what happened to them? And you didn't do anything about it? And they looked at him and says, son, says, you just don't know. Says, Wallace said, well, I'll tell you one thing, he won't whip me that way. And one of the older fellows said, oh, you just don't know. What are you going to do? Wallace said, I'm going to run away. Well, where are you going? The only place you can go in the woods. Well, it was just shortly thereafter, Mr. Horton came up and singled Wallace out and wanted to whoop him because they had been been harvesting corn, what we call breaking corn. Said his hands were sore, and he had to leave the cornfield and go right to the cotton field. In the cotton field, he had to pick cotton. And his doggone hands, he couldn't even close his fingers. And so Mr. Horton said, well, Wallace, you come over here. And he called up two other women. He called them up there and had them the way. He said, I'm going to find the reason why you hadn't picked any cotton. And Wallace's explanation was, he said he saw that fence over there, and he said, and I just decided to jump that fence just to see what the result would be. What he did is he took off and he went in the woods, and he stayed in the woods, he said, 4 or 5 days. But you had to be careful back then because they had guards on all the paths between the different plantations. And those guards had guns, and those guards had horses, and those guards had dogs. And you had to be very careful. Well, he stayed out there in the woods about on the 5th day. He said the only thing he found in those 5 days was one hickory nut that the squirrels had missed. That's the only thing he had to eat. So he slipped back to the cabins, and the hands came running up to him, according to Wallace, and said, look, so Mr. Chambers says that you'll go to his house in Pickersville up in town, because you'll go there, he'll feed you and he'll see that you won't get beat. So Wallace didn't have any choice, so he went to Mr. Chambers' house. And Mr. Chambers took him in and fed him and treated him good. And, I mean, he was living in high cotton. Well, the next day he sent him back out to the farm plantation. And guess who he found? Mr. Horton. And Mr. Horton had a different idea. So Mr. Horton was going to whoop him. So he tried to grab hold of Wallace. Now Wallace said, now remember he's about 15 years of age at the time. Wallace said, you know, I was a good wrestler. He said, but there's no way that I could put my hands on Mr. Horton or be aggressive in any kind of way. But I could take my legs and trip him and flip him as though I was trying to get away at the same time, putting the stuffings on him. I mean, that's what he did. And he did it until Mr. Horton just gave out, just out of breath. And he called Jeff, one of the stronger men there. Of course, while all this was going on, the other fellows, they were working. They would not look. Now, I want to point this out right there. I have read all this before, and before I got Wallace's manuscript, and I thought, there ain't no way people would buy somebody and then go out there and whoop them. I mean, that's like taking a 8420 John Deere tractor and going and let the air out of the tires. I mean, it just didn't make sense to me. But reading this, I believe it happened. It happened. That's just the way they were treated. But anyway, called Jeff over, and Jeff came over and held Wallace. And Mr. Horton tied his hands together. He said he gave him about 20 lashes. And then they got back to the cabins that night. And Wallace would get angry with the hands. He said, look, y'all didn't help me. You were helping Mr. Horton. And they said, man, you just don't understand how the system works. Said, you just got to go along with the program. Said, but after all those beatings and everything, said they would go back, and at night they were, they'd play the fiddle and dance and just have the best time, and like nothing had even happened. But they had to do that for survival. That's simply, they had to compartmentalize their lives. They had to have some freedom and some parameters in which to operate, to have some freedom of choice and freedom of movement. And but when it came to being a slave and working under somebody, it was a terrible, terrible thing. And they just learned to live with it. Well, Wallace, 3 more times at Pickersville, he ran away. And each time he would run away, the first place he would head he would head west to Columbus, Ohio. Now, Columbus, Ohio was a railroad. It was the New Orleans, Ohio Railroad. And it would go head north and go right on up to Corinth, right at the top, northeast of Mississippi. Now at Corinth, they had the largest contraband camp that probably in the South, about 6,000 slaves that had escaped, and they were at this camp at Corinth. And David Blight said what Wallace was trying to do was to get to that camp. But what the book says, he wasn't trying to get to any camp. You know what he was trying to do? He was trying to go to the marsh. He wanted to go home. That's what Wallace, according to Wallace, that's what he wanted to do. But anyway, each time he'd get a little closer and a little closer, and each time he'd get caught. And he tells several stories about that. One of which he got up to a slave cabin and had a fence around it. And this ferocious dog out there, and it was dark. And said he opened the gate to the fence and said that dog all of a sudden just quietened right down and walked off. And just about he got within, he said, 10 feet of the door. And said this little girl came walking out and saw him, and it scared the daylights out of her because she thought he was a ghost. Because there wasn't no way he could have got by that dog. But anyway, he would go and he'd be befriended at a lot of these places. One of the places he went, he taught a man how to read and how to write for food. Another place he went, he would trade those kind of things, and people would help him. It wasn't the Underground Railroad, but they would help him along the way. But sometimes he went to one place because he was light skinned, and he went to one place, and the lady looked at him and said, "Boy," said, "you get away from here." Says she thought what he had come up there and that he was part of the ownership there on that plantation, and she was scared to talk to him. But all of that, one time, the last time when he got within 15 miles of Corinth, there was this, and back then they had people, they were like bounty hunters. Their job was to go up and down the road, and you had to have a slip, a permission. Anything after 9 o'clock, you had to have permission. Anytime anybody that could see you, you had to show them that little pass. And their job was to go up and down that railroad and go up and down that road and catch these runaways and then call their masters. Well, each time James Chambers would go after Wallace and bring him back. And James, according to Wallace, talked to him and said, "Wallace, you got to quit doing this. I mean, you got to quit running away. Look what kind of image you to other folks." I mean, he was sort of like pleading with him. That sort of astounded me. But anyway, the guy called him and or got up with him, called there again, and told him for a telephone. I know they didn't have one then. I don't know how he got up with him. But anyway, he got the message to him. And James said, "Look, I'm not going up there. That's too close to Corinth, and I'm not going up there to those Union soldiers." And so they agreed to come halfway. But the way that man treated Wallace, I mean, they put him in shackles and chains and tied him to somebody else. At one time, the guy got drunk and threw him in the fire, and I mean, stuff like that. Well, Mr. Chambers met this man, and Wallace never gave him his name, but met this man about halfway, and Mr. Chambers was bringing Wallace on back home, back to Pickersville. And they got along the road and they met these Confederate soldiers. And these Confederate soldiers found out who he was and so forth. They tied Wallace to the tree. And they wanted to use him as target practice. And Mr. Chambers says, "You can't do that." Says, "You know, he is valuable." He didn't say anything about him being a human being. He didn't say anything about him being a person and a personality. He just said he was valuable. Well, the guys let him go. And so they went home, and Mr. Chambers said, "Well, I've had it. You've already run away 4 times. Last time you stayed gone 4 months." Says, "Wallace, I can't do anything but take you to Mobile, Alabama, and sell you." Well, they took off, and they go to Mobile, and this is the first time that that Wallace, that's in 1863, that Wallace was sold on an auction block. And he was sold for $2,000. You know, that was a lot of money. But then it was 1863, and you know what inflation did during the Civil War. Probably $2,000 in Mobile, Alabama in '63 was no more than $950 or $1,000 back in Richmond, Virginia in 1860. But anyway, he was sold. He was sold to Collier Minge. Collier Minge was a mercantile fellow there in Mobile. And it was his job to just run errands and be a house servant and that kind of thing, and to help work in the store. And Wallace did that quite well, but he was driving the horse and buggy going somewhere. And so the streetcar was coming by, and he wanted to beat the streetcar, so he hit the horse, and the horse took off. The shaft fell out, hit the rails. It overturned, threw Wallace out, and the horse took off. And of course they got him, carried him back to Mr. Minge. And Mr. Minge carried him down. They had him in Mobile. They had places where you know, if you had one of the slave beats, you take them and you'd pay them, and they'd beat them for so many, and they'd advertise that, Well, took Wallace there, and he said he got about, I forgot the number of lashes, like 30, 35 lashes. And Wallace said, that ain't gonna happen to me again. I mean, he's quite explicit in his book. But he said, Mr. Minge says, I bet you'll know how to find your way home now, won't you? Oh, yes, sir. So Minge went on left. So Wallace, rather than going home, he takes off, and he walks right out, South Mobile. He walks right out, and there was about 10,000 Confederates in garrison. But he walked out right through all of them, and went right out into the what they call the Foul River Estuary, which is on the western side of Mobile Bay. And it took him 3 weeks to go from there to finally find his freedom. And he found his freedom, guess what day? August the 24th of 1864. The boy was 18 years old. On his birthday. That was on his birthday. But he was talking about having to stay out in that swamp, and alligators and snake infested. And he said at night he would climb up into a watchtower. Said the Confederates would stay there during the day. They'd come down. When they'd come down, he'd go up that watchtower because he said there's mosquitoes. I can't say he said they were big as airplanes, because there again. But they were some monsters. Anyway, he would go up there at night before he'd sleep and get away from those mosquitoes. And then just before they'd get there in the morning, he'd get down. He had built him a little platform there on the estuary. And he said one night he prayed to God. He said, Lord, please, help me get on Dauphine Island, which is he was at Cedar Point, the very edge of end of Mobile, the south end. At Cedar Point, that's where he was, and he was trying to get to Dauphine Island because at Dauphine Island was where you know what Patricia's doing. She's giving me this, and that's my guardian angel there, Patricia. And honestly, she's the only one that can stop me, because I get excited because it would take 3 times to tell the story. Anyway, to make a long story short, he found his freedom. Gordon Granger, who was the commandant of the Union forces out there in Mobile, gave him a choice. He could join a black regiment, or he could work for an officer. He decided to work for an officer. Now, David said he wanted to work for an officer because he didn't want the confrontation and so forth. Wallace didn't want to work. Wallace didn't want to join the regiment because he didn't want to get in a situation where he'd have to shoot at one of his cousins. That's what Wallace did. I mean, he still had that loyalty to his home. It's just amazing. But anyway, and I'm gonna quit. I'm gonna tie up. Thank you, Patricia. There's a lady by the name of Christine McKay. Now, Christine McKay is an archivist at the Schomburg Center for Black Culture in Harlem, New York. Now in that place, she's phenomenal. She followed Wallace from there to the time he went to New York, and he was in New York. He stayed there, and he was on Broome Street, Minetta Lane. Minetta Lane is a very famous street, and it's the only street that's not part of the New York grid because it meanders. Because at one time the Indian named it Minetta because they call it Angry River because it just meandered to the river. And but that's where he lived, on 13 Minetta Lane, until 1879. In 1879, he moved over to Jersey City. And doggone old Christine said, you know where he moved to? 105 Van Horn Street, Jersey City, New Jersey. So that just tied everything in. But anyway, I love telling you this story, and I thank you for listening. I feel like I'm talking to family when I talk to you, and it's just a special time for me.
How you found it on the internet, you spotted that area, that little area where he lived.
Oh, yeah. Well, I Googled it, and you can Google it, and find out exactly where he lived and things like that. But it's a book worth reading, if for no other reason, because he was my cousin, and I'm proud of him. Thank you.